Welcome to Combinations, the podcast from North Staffordshire Combined Healthcare NHS Trust. This latest edition is being broadcast on the last day of Pride 2020. The story you're about to hear is Jenny's story. Jenny is chair of our staff side, has worked in the NHS for most of her working life, and also attends the board to represent staff side. She also happens to be trans. Jenny talks of her childhood, growing up knowing she was different from what society expected of her teenage years and university, of coming to work in the NHS and coming out as a trans woman. She talks about some of the prejudice and attacks she's experienced as a result of being visible and coming out, but also she talks about hopes for the future, and in particular for where she hopes Pride will be in 10 years' time, where it's able both to celebrate people for who they are, while not forgetting its roots as a movement of protest.
My name's Jenny Harvey. I've worked for the Trust for 30 years. I'm currently the chair of the staff side trade unions. My union is Unison. But for today, most importantly, I'm talking to you as a trans woman. One of the questions most trans men, trans women are asked is, when did you first realise you were a girl? And it's really hard to remember an exact time. I think in my mind it was about 9 or 10. Around about that time, I started to think, well, I don't fit in with what everybody's expecting of me. That doesn't feel right. But I didn't have the words or the vocabulary to really understand it. So I just felt I was somehow just weird as a kid. One summer's day when somehow I'd left in the house on my own, and I found myself just thinking about, why is it I feel like a girl yet nobody sees me as a girl? That can't be right. I remember on that day finding myself looking in my mum's wardrobe and thinking, why does it feel that it would be better for me to be wearing girls' clothes? And I remember trying some of my mum's clothes on and just weirdly just feeling right. Though they were clothes that were way too old for me. I was sort of 10 or 11 at the time. And this was back in the late 70s. So my mum's dresses were the sort of stuff that Margaret would wear in The Good Life, if you remember, that sort of stuff. So not exactly for a 10-year-old, but I do remember that first pivotal point of expressing to myself what I knew my gender was, but looking in the mirror and somehow thinking, that's right for me, but then immediately thinking, well, that must be wrong because that's not how I should be. That's not how everybody is telling me to be. I mean, back in them days, there was no real talk. Transgender wasn't even a word or a term that we understood. In fact, at school, I remember, I don't even think anybody would talk about people being lesbian or gay. This was the late 70s. So I just sort of internalised that and squashed those feelings up. And that's tough. Younger people of the age that I was when I realised, are able to have some more understanding because they've got the language, they've got the vocabulary, and it is talked about in schools. So instead of feeling frightened and alone, like I was, they're able to maybe express themselves, even though can be really, really difficult. And to be honest, from that moment on, every single day was filled with those thoughts. Every waking minute was filled with the thoughts that the world isn't seeing me how I am, and how do I fit in the world if that's how I feel? Is there something wrong with me? And coupled with that, with the shame, just the shame of thinking that if anybody knew my secret that was in my head, that was utterly shameful. And so I grew up with those feelings of awkwardness and weirdness and that constant cycle of shame. And, I don't think this is, of course, my story and not every trans person's story, but I imagine certainly many trans people of my age and generation may well relate to that. in many ways, I have to say, I had privileged upbringing in that I went to a nice school, and I had good parents and so forth. But I can't get away from the fact that every single waking day of that childhood was filled with these thoughts of isolation, loneliness, and weirdness. I went to university in Liverpool. And I'd hoped that somehow, the distractions of university or just getting on with life would suppress those feelings of those isolated feelings, but it didn't. So although I tried my best at university, I struggled to cope, to fit in. Not to say I didn't enjoy many aspects of it. It's freedom away from home and freedom behind closed doors to express yourself, and I did that. I was able to dress as me within my own room in the student union digs, but I could never tell anybody else, because even then, we're talking the end of the 80s. We're still in the period where we had a law called Section 28, where it made it unlawful for people in schools and education to talk about people being gay and lesbian, let alone was there any scope of coming out as a girl, coming out as trans. So I never thought it was possible, and I think I resigned myself that I've just got to try and get on with life. Got a job in the NHS, been here ever since. Absolutely love the NHS. Only meant to come to the trust from a holiday from university. Only meant to stay 2 months, and 30 years on, I wouldn't choose anything else. I did get to the point where I thought there's no way I could continue to live like this, to continue to be living that lie to myself, to continue to live in so unfulfilled, so unhappy. There was another really pivotal point in my journey, I think, because was when this is back at Bucknell Hospital. We managed to have our own offices as a trade union, so we had a little office set apart from anywhere else. And I was often in there on my own after hours, but I managed to get a wig delivered to work. I remember after hours in that office, putting on a wig and making my face up and looking in a mirror, and I just sobbed. It was the first time that I'd seen myself in any way that actually mirrored what I felt inside. It was extraordinary. I sobbed with joy, really. It was extraordinary, that moment. And again, these pivotal moments, I often wonder if they hadn't happened like that, whether I'd be where I am now. From that moment on, I think there was inevitability about my transition, because I looked in the mirror and thought, I could do this. I could actually do this. Because up to that point, I'd never thought it was possible. I'd never thought it was possible that I could actually transition and live. I'm 6'2" and not slightly built. I'm a big, I'm the side of a house in many ways. And I just thought, there's no way that I could live my life. I could transition and live my life. It's just not possible. So I'd always tried to resign myself to be realistic. But that moment when I looked in the mirror and saw myself as I could be, was just such a turning point. So from that moment on, I started to get more and more confident. I started to explore going out, and this is a typical story. You'll find for many people of my generation, going out after dark to 24-hour Tesco's and doing some shopping as a woman, and just sort of stepping out into the public and getting a bit more braver and braver, because you realise that people were fine, and people generally either didn't notice or didn't really care that much, which was, fine by me. So I started getting braver and braver, First I remember my first real brave step out in daylight into the public. I decided to go shopping round Stafford, just because I thought not many people will know me there necessarily. And I'm walking around and thinking, this is all right. I'm doing really well here. Look, I'm okay. People aren't, generally staring at me. I'm living my life. This is going well. And I'm looking in the shop window, seeing my reflection and seeing, well, you look like a woman, that you're doing, okay, Jenny. At that moment, I tripped. I remember this vividly. I tripped over in front of everybody, completely A over T. My wig fell off. What I was using to help that I don't need now in terms of giving me a shape. My for want of a better word, my boots fell out, and I was scrabbling on the floor, grazed up, and looking up at people, going, "Are you all right, Doc? Are you all right, Doc?" And I was absolutely mortified, absolutely mortified. But then I thought, well, I survived that. It was a terribly embarrassing experience, but I survived that. I can survive pretty much anything, I think. So it was, again, an accident, but sort of turning point and giving me confidence. The fact that I'd found myself in such a... It's always humiliating to fall over in front of people, but when you crash down like I do, to find that I could cope and I could live, and what's the worst could happen. So again, that was a moment that just said to me, this is going to happen. This has got to happen. And from that point on, I knew that I was going to transition, that I was going to be full time as myself, as Jenny, which is what I needed to be. I really needed it. Eventually, I was living outside of work pretty much full time as Jenny, but in work, I was still in my old identity, and nobody knew. I mean, I think if you'd lined up every person in the trust and said who may be trans, I would probably been right down the bottom end, the last person you'd think of. Absolutely nobody would have known. So what I did is I got some photos I'd taken off a webcam of just how I looked when I was Jenny, and I started to share these with people. I'd show some colleagues at work and friends and say, look, I need you to know this is how I am when I'm not at work, and at some point I think this is how I'll be at work. And the reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. They were massively surprised. Everybody was really surprised, but it was so supportive, people giving that positive feedback. It became a bit of a drug, if I remember at the time. I was sort of getting that positive feedback that actually, you're okay, you look okay, you could do this, was great. And I must have shown that photo to more people than needed to, I think. And after a couple of weeks of that, I sort of came to the point, well, I've told enough people, there really seems to be no unearthly reason why I don't transition. I think it's very different these days about transitioning, I think people are encouraged to have conversations with HR and think about how they're going to communicate to colleagues and things like that. But this was 2005, 2006, so there wasn't quite the awareness of trans issues as there is now. So what I did is I just phoned, I remember phoning our director of HR at Bucknell Hospital. I said, David, I said, on Monday I'm going to be coming into work, and I'm coming into work as Jenny, just so you know, so that when I turn up at meetings. And he went, that's fine, didn't know what else to say. So the Monday, that next Monday after the weekend, that was it. I got myself ready, nervous as anything. This is going to be my first day out into the big wide world of work, and went to work. And from that day on, I've lived and worked and been Jenny absolutely every moment of my life. As the lead for staff side, I had to give a presentation my first day to a bunch of strangers. So, I had to go into it, full pelt. I couldn't really be softly about it. But maybe that was better for me. Just the Big Bang Theory. I just went for it. There's one person I hadn't managed to tell, and I don't know why. Anyway, I remember him coming into our office, and this was on my first day. He came into the office and he just didn't recognise me because I got my wig on, I was made up, and I got my I was dressed very different, obviously. So he didn't recognise who I was, and he was stood there in a conversation with somebody else. And I said, "Oh, hi, Ian. I'm really sorry. I meant to tell you, but..." And literally the colour drained from his face and he started to wobble a bit. I think it was such a shock to him, bless him. And so from that day onwards, I've been Jenny at work. And in many ways, I feel really blessed that my union and my NHS sort of have embraced that, and I've generally had nothing but support from my employer. I'm not saying there aren't times that it's been difficult, and that I've had comments and people have misgendered me, and sometimes still do get my gender wrong. I mean, they're only small words, he and she and him and her, but when you're a trans person and somebody refers to you in the wrong gender, it hurts every time it does. It's like the world telling you, just for a moment, well, who do you think you're kidding? So I still struggle with that. I've never quite found a way to properly rationalise it, but I cope, because I know that in every single case that's happened, as far as I'm concerned, the people haven't done it deliberately, and it's very often people who care for me, who work with me. So, I try and just work through that. The past few years have been difficult, I think, for trans people. There's been a huge rise in visibility, which is great. That there are now trans role models. If I'm growing up now, I can see trans people on the television in the news, and there are people that you can see and aspire to and look up to as role models. And I think that's amazing, because I wish I just had that as when I was a kid. So that's great. And there is education in school. Also, non-binary people coming to the fore and saying, this is my identity, and we're recognising them. But it has been difficult these last few years, because with that rise in visibility, we've seen a rise in anti-trans views within the media and press, and an obsession in some of the press. And that becomes difficult. And I know it's affected my mental health, and I know I've got trans friends on Twitter, and they will say how it's affected their mental health, this constant battle. It's been described in some areas as a culture war between people who want to progress trans rights, like myself, and I would hope most people that I trust, and the people who don't think we should have those same rights, who don't maybe see me as a woman. And that's hard when you're hearing that. And there's been many a night where I've just been sobbing, reading what's going to be in the papers the next day, or just seeing what somebody's put on Twitter. That's hard to hear, because those words are going out to so many people. And we have seen so much negative stories in the press. It's just, if I listed them, we would be here for another hour. Papers, not just tabloids, but papers like broadsheets have seemed to have have fixed on an agenda that seems to be in some way against progress in trans rights. And that's what it's about. It's against progressive reform that we need, just to make trans people's lives a bit easier. There seem to be people against that. I mean, this sort of backlash became evident to me maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when I was lucky enough to appear. I got onto the audience of BBC Question Time. It was being filmed from Stoke-on-Trent, and it was being done live, and it's never done live normally, because I think there was a by-election. So I do remember it being an audience, thinking I could say whatever I want here and get it on the telly. But I thought it'd be good, and I did manage to catch David Dimbleby's eye, and it seemed to go well down in the audience. I got some applause, and I sort of felt good about myself for a moment or two. Yeah, and I thought, great, that's another thing ticked off. And actually, I thought it's good for visibility. I do know when people see and hear me that they probably realise that I'm trans, and I thought, well, if that just is a positive for trans visibility, for just me to be in the audience just for that moment, then maybe that's a good thing. And I remember straight after film, and it was sort of midnight almost, I got back to the car. I remember this so vividly, because it was raining. It was raining really hard, and it was dark, and I'm sat in the car, and I thought, I'll check on Twitter what people thought of my comments about the politics. Right? And so I scrolled back. I expected a few people having a go at me because I was being political and telling me I was wrong. But what I wasn't prepared for was the overwhelming deluge of transphobia that was linked around my contribution. So all I saw was tweet after tweet, screenshot after screenshot of me with the words along the lines of "What the F is that?" Dehumanizing language. It was a deluge. I mean, it was just nobody was caring what I said at that moment, or so it seemed. They were just there to make negative comments about me, about my appearance or everything else, but really about me being a trans woman. In honesty, it was so bad that actually the BBC rang me the next day, worried about my welfare, because they'd obviously been looking at the hashtag, and an online LGBT news site, Pink News, the biggest LGBT news site in the country, ran an article that night about me. They didn't contact me, but they ran an article about the abuse I'd received, and it's still up there on the internet today. These things last forever, I guess. So it'd be painful to look at it again. But that was awful, and I must admit that nearly broke me. I mean, and this is 10 years after my transition, and somebody in a role that's living day in, day out. There's nothing I hadn't done really as a woman. I mean, I've stood up in front of 2,000 people at Unison conferences and given speeches, and there's nothing that I haven't been able to do really as a trans woman. But for that moment, it nearly broke me. It was like the moment that I put my head up into wider society, that somehow the world had passed judgment. Now, I know that wasn't how everybody felt. And I know in the main these were just bigoted people trolling, or just picking on people for cheap laughs, just as people sadly do for anybody that's got a difference, anybody of difference. But it did. I mean, that moment was such a traumatic experience. I mean, I'd be loath to call it having a post-traumatic syndrome over this, but I still think about it. Which is something I shouldn't do, carry around pictures of all those tweets that I saved. I still catch them, like somehow I can't let them go. So then that's something I've got to work through. But I think that just shows what an impact that had on me. And and part of me was to protect myself about getting complacent again about my place in the world, which is a real shame, because the truth of the matter is, in my everyday life and everybody I meet, I'm not treated with anything but respect for being a woman or for being trans. I genuinely am not. I can't think of him on my streets in Stoke. They've been completely welcoming to me. So the world can be a welcoming place for trans people, but it just seems that sometimes if you try and just take that one step too far, and some people want to put you into your place, I think. And one of the real things that I've been doing, I guess, partly I think in a more selfish way, is to help my own mental health, but actually to push back against this negativity is to be getting more active on trans issues. So I'm currently delivering training to the trust and wider on some trans awareness, because I think it is a subject that many people, clinicians, sometimes feel ill-equipped to talk about. I think just because of the language, because if you're not lived experience and you're not having that information, it can be difficult. So the trust has, I'm thankful the trust has allowed me to start delivering some of this training, which the feedback has been pretty good. So I'm hoping to do more and more of that, because it's for me, it's got two benefits. One, it helps me feel like I'm doing something positive, but also I think it helps educate us all. So when we're supporting our service users and patients and our colleagues, if we have trans colleagues, we're better able to understand trans inclusion. It's all part of that inclusion agenda. We talk a lot about for LGBT people, but same for our BAME members, of having allies to inclusion matters. And that is people who don't identify actually being supportive and helping to make the world better. Because we need allies as trans people, because there aren't that many of us. We're something like 0.6 to 1% of the population, and we're dispersed. So we do need people to engage in the subject, to understand better, to take a bit of time to understand better, and to help advocate for us when we need it, because it is very difficult for our voice to be heard sometimes when, we can talk to our colleagues, but the press is constantly giving out these stories to hundreds of thousands of people. Somebody was asking me about Pride the other day, and what Pride is, and I was thinking about what Pride might be in the future. I think Pride is really important for all LGBT people, and actually Pride was born out of protest, and we must not forget that part of Pride is protesting for rights, about improving our rights. But I'd like to see, if I look sort of 10 years hence, what Pride could be. I don't think Pride should forget its roots in protest, but the Pride should be about being proud to be who we are, and that we are able to live our lives. So it would be great if Pride in the future was as it is now, a celebration of LGBT identities. It is about a time to reflect on the history for LGBT people, but it is we haven't got that. We haven't got a situation where we're having LGBT people suffering inequalities as we currently still do. Yeah, so I hope Pride in the future keeps that positive celebration aspect and allows us to reflect on where we've come, so we don't forget about the fight that in history that some people had to make for LGBT equality. I must admit, I was really flattered to be asked to do this podcast, because I've been a big fan of podcasts. I think podcasts are important. They are part of social media, but they're also a chance to listen to other people's lives and other people's experiences. So I don't know. I don't know how many people will listen to this, but maybe there's somebody else out there that's a trans person that's struggling to come to terms with their gender identity, or scared of transitioning or coming out, and maybe if anything from my story is, it is okay. You can live your life. I have to say to people, if I can transition, then anybody can transition. And that's not to say it might be difficult. That we risk a lot when we transition. We can risk our family and our friends and our jobs, but if that's what you need to do, you can do that, and you can find a community through social media, online, if you're feeling isolated. So that was just why I was so pleased to do this podcast.